Power is a heavy burden that can break even the strongest of kings when they lose their way. Witness the rise and fall of empires and the lessons learned from the ruins of a broken crown. Subscribe today for the most epic tales of power and loss.
The hospital gift shop where I work part-time sells these little ceramic angels, and my stepmother once held one up at a family dinner and asked, loud enough for the whole table, whether that was the kind of merchandise a real career involved. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because by then, laughing was easier than the alternative. What none of them knew was that the man sitting beside me, the one they'd nicknamed the handyman behind his back, would 6 weeks later stand up at my brother's wedding and make my stepmother's wine glass shake in her hand. But I'm getting too far ahead. Let me start where it actually started. My name is Tessa Holloway. I'm 28. I do two things for a living that my family has decided don't count. I'm a hospice social worker during the week, and on weekends I run the gift shop register at Mercy General because the extra money helps and because, honestly, I like the quiet of it. My father remarried when I was 16, 2 years after my mom died, and the woman he married came with a worldview I'd spend the next 12 years failing to measure up to. Her name is Diane. She came from money, the kind that doesn't talk about itself but never stops reminding you it's there. She organized charity galas. She knew which fork. She had opinions about everyone's career arc, and she delivered them like weather reports, calm and certain and impossible to argue with. When she married my dad, she also got my older brother Garrett and me as a package deal. And from the start, it was obvious which of us she considered the better investment. Garrett went into finance. He works at one of those firms with a name made of 3 last names, and he wears the kind of watch that costs more than my car. Diane adored him. At every gathering, the conversation orbited around Garrett's promotions, Garrett's apartment in the city, Garrett's girlfriend, who is now his fiancée, a sharp, polished woman named Priya, whose family Diane had been thrilled to connect with. And then there was me, the one who, in Diane's words, works with the dying. Said the way you'd describe someone who collects roadkill. I want to be fair, because this isn't a story where I was a saint and they were monsters. My dad isn't a cruel man. He's a weak one, which I've come to understand is its own kind of cruelty when you're the kid on the receiving end. He let Diane set the temperature of the house, and the temperature was always a few degrees colder when it pointed at me. He'd watch her make a comment, and I'd watch his jaw tighten, and then he'd reach for the breadbasket and say nothing. 8 years of breadbaskets. That's how I think of that part of my life now. The thing about hospice work is that it teaches you what actually matters, and it ruins you for small talk about square footage. I sit with people in their last days. I help families say the things they've been swallowing for decades. I've held the hand of a 90-year-old machinist who cried because he never told his son he was proud of him. And I've watched that son arrive 40 minutes too late. You carry that home. You carry it to Thanksgiving dinner, and then your stepmother asks if you've considered getting a real job with growth potential. And something inside you just goes very, very quiet. I met him at the worst possible time, which is maybe the only time you really meet anyone. His grandmother was one of my patients. Her name was Eunice, 91, sharp as a tack, dying of the thing that eventually catches up with all of us. He came every single day, not the way some families do, performing their grief for the staff. He just showed up, sat with her, read to her, fixed the wobbly leg on her bedside table because it bothered her. He wore work boots and flannel, and had hands that looked like they'd actually built things. We talked in the hallway during my breaks. He told me he ran a small operation out in the county. I assumed he meant a farm or a contracting business. He let me assume it. That detail matters later. His name is Wyatt. The first time he asked me to dinner, I almost said no, because dating a patient's family member felt complicated. And because I'd gotten so used to bracing for disappointment that I'd half forgotten how to want things. But Eunice, in one of her clearer moments, grabbed my wrist and said, "That boy is the realest thing in this entire building. Don't be an idiot." So I wasn't an idiot. Eunice passed in March. Wyatt and I had been seeing each other for 2 months by then. Quietly, the way you do when something feels too fragile to expose to daylight. He grieved like a grown man, which is to say he let himself feel it and didn't make it my job to fix. We grew closer in the after. I learned he woke at 5 every morning. I learned he could cook exactly 4 things and made all 4 of them constantly. I learned he had a way of going still and listening when I talked about a hard day, really listening, that I had never experienced from a human being who shared my last name. What I didn't learn, because he didn't volunteer it and I didn't think to ask the right question, was the full shape of what he did for a living. The first time my family met him was a disaster, and I should have read it as a forecast. It was a Sunday dinner at my dad and Diane's house. The big one in the development with the white columns Diane insists on calling a portico. Wyatt showed up in clean jeans and a button-down holding a pie he'd made himself, and I watched Diane's eyes do the thing. The full-body scan eyes do the thing. The full-body scan, the instant appraisal. She took the pie like it might be contaminated and set it at the far end of the counter where it stayed, untouched, the entire night. At dinner, she did what she does. "So, Wyatt, Tessa tells us you're in agriculture?" The pause before the word was a small knife. He said he worked in land and resource management, which was true, and she nodded the way you nod at a child explaining their drawing. Garrett asked, with a smirk I wanted to slap off his face, whether there was good money in dirt these days. Wyatt just smiled and said some years were better than others. My dad asked him about the weather. Diane asked Priya about the wedding venue. Wyatt got asked exactly 2 questions the entire evening, both about whether he could fix things around the house, as though he'd come as the help. On the drive home, I apologized so many times he finally pulled over. "Tessa," he said, "I don't need them to like me. I need to know it doesn't change how you see me when they treat me like that." I told him it didn't. He looked at me a long moment and said, "Okay, then we're fine." And the strange thing is, we were. That night, I didn't cry in the bathroom the way I used to after family dinners. I had someone in the car who'd seen the whole ugly thing and chosen me anyway. Have you ever sat at a table where everyone shares your blood and still felt like a guest? Where the love is conditional on a version of you that you were never going to become? If you know that specific loneliness, you already understand the next part of this story. Because I'd spent years thinking the problem was something I needed to fix about myself. It took a man with calloused hands and a quiet voice to show me the problem was never mine to fix. The wedding was set for late summer. Garrett and Priya, a country club ceremony, 300 guests, the whole production financed in large part by Diane, who treated it as her personal coronation. I was invited, of course. I was even given a role, the kind of role that's an insult dressed as an honor. I wasn't a bridesmaid. I was assigned to help coordinate the guest book and gift table, which is to say, I was staff at my own brother's wedding. Wyatt was invited as my +1, grudgingly. After I'd had a tense phone call with Diane in which she'd actually asked whether I really wanted to bring him to something this important. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. I sat on my bathroom floor the week before and seriously considered fabricating a work emergency. Wyatt found me there. He sat down on the cold tile next to me. This big man folding himself onto the floor, and he didn't tell me to be strong or to rise above it. He just said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But I think you should go. Not for them. For you. So you never wonder if you let them chase you off." So I decided to go. I had no idea what was going to happen there. Neither did he, not fully. But he knew something I didn't. And he'd made a quiet decision of his own that week. One he didn't tell me about until it was over. Here's the part I didn't know about my own boyfriend. Wyatt's small operation out in the county was 4,000 acres of land his family had been stewarding for 3 generations. But that was almost beside the point. The real thing was what his grandfather had started, and what Wyatt had spent the last decade building into something enormous, a land conservation and rural development trust that had quietly become one of the most significant private conservation entities in the region. We're talking a portfolio worth well into the hundreds of millions. He'd partnered with universities. He'd testified in front of the state legislature. He sat on boards. He had funded the construction of 2 rural hospitals, including a wing of the very network that owned Mercy General, the hospital where I rang up ceramic angels on Saturdays. He drove a 15-year-old truck, not because he had to, but because he genuinely did not care about the things my family had organized their entire identities around. And the country club where my brother was getting married? It sat on a parcel of land adjacent to a watershed that Wyatt's trust had spent 4 years and a small fortune protecting. He knew people in that world. He just never mentioned it, because mentioning it wasn't who he was. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I'll give Diane that. Priya was stunning. Garrett cried, which surprised me and softened something in me toward him for about an hour. I did my little job at the gift table. I smiled. I wore the dress I could afford and pretended not to notice Diane's once-over when she passed. Wyatt stood near me in a suit that fit him properly. And a few of the guests, the kind who can smell quality, kept glancing at him like they were trying to place him. The reception was where it happened. There were speeches. Diane gave one, of course, a long one, in which she managed to mention the family's standards and legacy no fewer than 4 times. Garrett spoke. The best man spoke, and then, during the loose part of the evening when people are circulating with drinks, an older man approached our corner of the room. Distinguished, silver hair. The bearing of someone used to being the most important person in any room. I recognized him vaguely as someone important to the venue. A board member maybe. The kind of guest Diane had been name-dropping all week, as proof of how connected the wedding was. He walked right past Garrett, right past my father. He walked up to Wyatt, and his face did something I'll remember for the rest of my life. It opened. "I'm sorry," he said, "but are you Wyatt? Wyatt from the Hargrove Trust?" I felt the air in our little circle change. Wyatt shook his hand and said yes, quietly, like it was nothing. The man would not let go of his hand. "My God, I've been trying to get a meeting with your office for 8 months. The watershed project, the rural health initiative, the work you did on the Eastern Corridor. That's, son, you have no idea. The impact." He turned to the small crowd that had begun to gather, drawn by the energy the way people are. "Do you all know who this is? This is the man behind the Hargrove Conservation Trust. He's done more for this part of the state than the last 3 administrations combined." I watched it land. I watched it land on Garrett first, who had wandered over with Priya. I watched the smirk he'd been wearing since the night they met curdle into confusion and then into something worse. I watched my father set down his drink, and I watched Diane, who had been mid-sentence with a cluster of her gala friends, go absolutely white. Because Diane knew that name. Of course she knew it. She'd spent 2 years trying to get the Hargrove Trust to sponsor one of her charity events, and had never even gotten a call back. She'd complained about it at this very wedding's planning dinner. The Hargrove Trust, she'd said, was impossible to reach, run by some recluse who thinks he's too good for everyone. The recluse was eating her wedding canapés. The recluse had made her stepdaughter a pie. The board member kept talking, oblivious to the wreckage he was causing, listing Wyatt's accomplishments to an expanding audience. Someone asked how Wyatt knew the couple. And Wyatt, in the most level voice you can imagine, said, "I'm here with Tessa. She's my partner." And he put his hand on my back. In front of all of them. In front of the people who'd seated me at the gift table. The board member turned to me with new eyes. And what do you do? I'd answered that question 1,000 times in that family and watched faces glaze over. So I braced for it. I'm a hospice social worker, I said. He didn't glaze over. He put his hand to his chest. That's the hardest, most important work there is, he said. My wife was in hospice last year. The social worker who helped us was the only reason we survived it. And he meant it. You could see he meant it. He looked at me like I was someone worth looking at. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when a current is running through them. Diane stepped forward, recovering, switching into the mode she does best. The gracious hostess, suddenly remembering she had a stepdaughter. Wyatt, she said, with a warmth that hadn't existed 20 minutes earlier. We had no idea. You should have said something. And Wyatt looked at her, not cruelly. That's the thing I keep coming back to. There was no cruelty in him. He just looked at her and said, "Why would it matter? I was the same person at your dinner table in March." Then he turned to the board member and said he'd be glad to set up that meeting. Here's my card, and the conversation moved on, and Diane was left standing there holding a smile that had nowhere to go. We didn't make a scene. We didn't need to. The scene made itself. I'd love to tell you that the rest of the night was a triumphant march, but mostly it was strange and quiet. Garrett found me by the dessert table later. He didn't apologize. Not really. He doesn't have the equipment for that. But he said, "I didn't know, Tess." And I said, "I know you didn't. That's kind of the whole problem, isn't it?" He didn't have an answer. My father found me by the coat check at the end of the night. He looked older than I'd seen him look. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. Which was the closest he could come to everything he should have said and never did. I told him Mom would have liked a lot of things about my life if anyone had bothered to ask. He nodded and looked at his shoes. 8 years of bread baskets summarized in a man who couldn't meet his daughter's eyes at a coat check. Diane called me the following Tuesday. The voicemail was a marvel of engineering, full of phrases like "moving forward" and "as a family," and put any misunderstandings behind us. She invited Wyatt and me to dinner. A real dinner, she stressed. I sat with that voicemail for 2 days. Here's what I'd learned, sitting with dying people for a living. At the end, nobody talks about the fork they used. Nobody talks about square footage, or job titles, or who married up. They talk about whether they were loved, and whether they let themselves love back, and whether they wasted time being small when they could have been kind. I'd watched that play out at 100 bedsides. I wasn't going to need a deathbed to learn it. So I called Diane back. I didn't scream. I didn't list the 8 years. I just said, "I appreciate the invitation. But I need you to understand something. Wyatt and I will come to family events. I'll be polite, but the version of me you respected starting last Saturday, the one you suddenly have time for, she's the exact same person you sat at the gift table. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be with the woman who works with the dying and rings up the register on weekends, the one you couldn't be bothered with. Not with my boyfriend's bank account. Think about whether you actually want that. Take your time. I've got nothing but time, and I've learned to spend it carefully." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "That's fair." And I think it might have been the first honest thing she ever said to me. We did go to that dinner eventually. It was awkward. It's still awkward. Diane is trying, in the clumsy way of a person who built her whole self around a value system that just collapsed in front of 300 wedding guests. My dad is in his own quiet reckoning. Garrett and I text now, occasionally, real texts. And once he asked me about my work and actually listened to the answer. It's not a fairy tale. It's just people, fumbling toward something better than where they started, which is maybe the only kind of happy ending that's real. Wyatt and I got engaged in the fall, out on his land, no audience, no production, just the two of us and a 15-year-old truck and a ring that had been his grandmother Eunice's. He asked if I wanted a big wedding to show them. I said no. I'd spent enough of my life performing for people who weren't really watching. The ones who see you don't need a show. I think about that older man at the wedding sometimes, the one who knew Wyatt's name and held his hand too long. He didn't unmask anyone. He didn't expose a fraud. All he did was see clearly, out loud, in a room full of people who'd trained themselves not to. And it turned out that was enough to bring the whole careful structure down, because that structure was only ever held up by everyone agreeing to look at the wrong things. I'm not in the family photographs from the years they were ashamed of me, but I'm in the ones from now. And the difference between then and now isn't why it's money. It's that I finally stopped waiting at the table for people to pass me the salt, and got up, and built a life worth being seen for. They can see it now or not. Either way, I already do. For years I believed the cold seat at the table was something I'd earned, like there was a flaw in me that everyone but me could see clearly. Sitting with that now, after everything, I understand it backwards. Diane never dismissed me because I was less. She dismissed me because she'd built her whole worth on a scoreboard, and I refused to play. That's the cause that set everything in motion. When you measure people by their job titles and their bank accounts, you eventually stop being able to see people at all, and a person who can't see clearly will always, eventually, walk straight into a wall. Diane's wall just happened to be a quiet man in work boots holding a homemade pie. Here's what I keep turning over. Wyatt never lied to anyone. He never hid who he was. He simply refused to perform. And in a family trained to look at the wrong things, that was enough to make him invisible right up until it wasn't. The lesson there isn't that money changes how people treat you, though it does. The lesson is about what you choose to look at. Diane looked at the boots. The board member looked at the man. Same Wyatt. Two completely different rooms. If I could hand my younger self anything, it wouldn't be Wyatt's secret. It would be 3 things I had to learn the slow way. The first is to keep your decency even when people give you every reason to abandon it. Wyatt could have humiliated Diane that night and the room would have cheered. He didn't. He just told the truth plainly and let it do the work, and that restraint said more about his character than any net worth ever could. The second is to actually see clearly, to stop accepting other people's measurements of your life as if they were facts. It took me 12 years and 100 bedsides to understand that the woman ringing up ceramic angels on a Saturday was never the failure in that house. The third is the one that costs the most. And that's the steadiness to keep standing in a place where you're treated as small without letting it shrink you. I went to that wedding. I sat on a bathroom floor and decided to go anyway. That choice, not Wyatt's money, is the thing I'm actually proud of. The strange gift of working with the dying is that nobody at the end ever brags about the fork they used or the title on their door. They talk about whether they loved well and whether they let themselves be loved back. My family spent years sorting people into worthy and unworthy, and it cost them the one daughter who'd have sat with them at the end without checking their resume first. I stopped waiting for them to pass me the salt. I got up, and I built a life worth being seen for. They can see it now or not. Either way, I finally do.